Hello there, this is Louise again and welcome. I'm glad you're here. In my last video, I spoke about my daughter falling into unconsciousness. It's unbelievable how suddenly she was fine 1 minute and then suddenly collapsed the next. This was one of the most terrifying experiences of our lives, and it was the beginning of a journey I never expected our family to face. I will continue to share my story. We were told Eliana would be residing in the ICU. She would be cared for by a team of highly trained nurses and doctors who are trained in urology and critical care. They would provide the highest level of intensive care and monitoring, so we knew Eliana was in safe hands. While we were all waiting, I was allowed to use the phone to call overseas to speak and to inform my dear sister Mandy what had happened. I tried to tell her as much as I could, but I didn't know too much myself. When I told her, she was very shocked, like the rest of us. My sister came to visit a year ago before and bonded with the kids well during her short visit. She had several conversations with Eliana and commented to me what a lovely young girl she had become. She always thought that Eliana seemed like an old soul, and that she was a wise young lady for only 12 years old. Mandy tried her utmost best to be positive during the call, and it kind of helped a little bit, but it was still difficult, and I was still too upset. I told her I would call her the next day, and that I would keep her updated as to what was going on. It was hard for me to put the phone down, but there isn't too much a person can do when they are 4,000 miles away, except to pray. After some time of anxiously waiting, one of the nurses came into the waiting room and told us we could go in to see her. Dan, the kids, my mom, and Chris followed the nurse into the ICU. My eyes suddenly started welling up with tears as we walked into the room, and then I began to cry a little when I glanced over at our dear daughter. She appeared so helpless and vulnerable. I knew deep within me that I had to stay strong and positive. After all, I know even though Eliana was in a comatose state, she could hear us. It was important we sent good thoughts and prayers her way, but it was very difficult seeing her laying there with all these tubes around her. She was hooked up to the ventilator because she was unable to breathe on her own. She also had an IV and an ICP monitor. The ICP monitor measures brain pressure, which helps know the level of consciousness of the patient. There were EVD tubes inserted in her head to drain the excess fluid from her brain. The arterial line was used for the doctors and nurses to monitor blood level. So many tubes all over the place that I could not begin to explain. Seeing Eliana this way was very overwhelming and upsetting for all of us. We clung to the tiniest ray of hope, because as long as there's hope, there is life. And this is what we needed to believe in, especially during those terrible lonely hours, sitting and talking to our dear daughter and holding her hand. My mum was especially fond of her first granddaughter and was devastated and found it also incomprehensible to see her in this state, hooked up on the hospital bed, her eyes closed, laying there with no movement. My poor mum was never to see Eliana chatting and laughing again, so she sat with me, supporting me as we talked to her for hours, stroking her arm and her face. Eliana was never alone during this terrible time, which is indeed a source of comfort for me today. My mum and I were allowed to stay with Eliana in the same room. Dan took the kids home and he was to return early the next day. My good friend Chris offered her support too, and told us that she would be back the following day also. It was hard for Dan to leave Eliana, as each evening she lay in such critical care, But again, we tried to stay positive, hoping for a miracle. The first night I never slept. I felt sick to my stomach with worry. I lay on the couch with my eyes closed, praying in my head for Eliana to get better. I would constantly hear the ventilator machine and the whispering voices of the nurses as they helped look after our dear daughter throughout the night. I would stand by Eliana's bedside, stroking her arm, telling her that everything will be okay and that everyone is praying for her to get better. It was strange seeing Eliana's chest rising up and down, yet she was in a very deep, comatose state. She looked like she was sleeping soundly, yet it was strange for me when I whispered in her ear and didn't get a response, such as a nod or something of that nature. The doctor and the nurse would quietly come into the room checking her vital signs. Constant care was needed for Eliana because of the delicate condition she was in. In the early hours of Tuesday morning, the team of neurologists who were assigned to Eliana met in the conference room discussing Eliana's condition. In the meantime, I had the critical care nurse call for the chaplain because I really needed spiritual support as I felt so distressed. Dan and the kids wouldn't be here for another hour. My poor mom couldn't do anything as she was in shock also. She could not comprehend the situation and didn't know what to do. In fact, none of us could comprehend the situation. After a short few minutes, the chaplain walked in. I breathed a sigh of relief to see her because I knew she would give us both peace and comfort by praying for Eliana and hoping that God will bless Eliana and help her in any way he could. My mom, the chaplain, and I held hands and prayed over Eliana's bedside. It was very spiritual. I felt a little more reassured after the prayer. I talked to the chaplain a little after we prayed, and I felt a peace in the room. I continually kept stroking Eliana's hair and whispered, "We are praying that you will get better and that we all love you so very, very much. You are in good hands and you will never be alone here." And I told her again that I loved her. Not long after, I heard the sound of children in the hallway. I popped my head around the door, and Jessica and Daniel came walking in along with Dan. I was so pleased to see them, our family united once again during this tragic time in our lives. Jessica was carrying a plastic bag with her. She came in and placed the bag on Eliana's bed. I asked her what was in the bag, and she said in a bright, childlike voice, "Barbies. Maybe when Sis gets better, we can play with our Barbie dolls." I turned to Jessica and said, "What a nice thought, Jess. I'm sure Sis would love that." Jessica always used to call her respected older sis. Little did Jessica know what the dire circumstances of Eliana's condition and how life-threatening the situation was. I felt a sudden sadness at that moment for Jessica and Daniel and hugged them both tightly. As we were all quietly talking, the neurologist at the door came and stood at the door and asked to speak to Dan and I. He took both of us aside to discuss Eliana's condition. The neurologist and his team found that Eliana had suffered from an AVM, an arteriovenous malformation. This means that the blood vessels in one part of a brain are abnormal, therefore can leak or rupture at any time, leading to damaged brain cells. This malformation was something she was born with, apparently, and it started during fetal development. Eliana suffered a rupture on the right side of her brain, which explains why she complained her left side felt numb. The right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. Dan and I were at a loss for words. We were speechless. The neurologist explained to us that Eliana is in very grave condition and has blood clots in her brain. They were running out of options. The pressure in her brain could result in a crushed brain stem if they didn't act quickly. The team of neurologists tried several different approaches, but none of them seemed to work. However, there was one last option which needed our approval, which was administering medication into the vein through the IV so they could treat the swelling of the brain tissue, which would in turn speed up the drainage of cerebral spinal fluid. Dan and I told the doctors to do what they had to, so they went ahead to proceed with the final treatment. We just wanted Eliana to get better and to bring her home. Eliana was a healthy, happy, smart girl and lived her life to the full and never had headaches. She lived her 12 years to the fullest, and not one of us knew she had an AVM. In the early afternoon, Chris decided to leave and go home so she could send an email out to the school to let everyone know what was going on. I had heard that there were so many people sending prayers our way since the news broke. By the second day, most of our community knew about Eliana being in hospital. So many people were very concerned and anxious. It was nice to know that everyone was concerned and that we weren't so alone, and all the prayers sent our way were signs of comfort to us as a family. While the doctors went ahead to perform the final treatment, the clinical psychologist stopped by the room so she could take Jessica and Daniel to her room. Her job was to explain to both Daniel and Jessica the reason why Eliana is sick and to answer any questions they may have or what may be bothering them. In conjunction with this, she would use a technique called art therapy, which is helpful for children who have witnessed any kind of trauma. During the following 2 hours, the procedure started working a little. I noticed that the cerebral fluid seemed to be draining out a little quicker through the EVD tube, which was inserted in her head. However, this finally slowed down during the course of the day. The doctors and critical care nurses tried to stay positive, but the hours seemed to suddenly appear a little darker as time went on. Deep in my mind, there was still a very tiny glimmer of hope, which we desperately hung on to. I want to thank you again for listening to my story. It's very hard to relive all the events, but it's important to speak about my daughter because her life and who she was still matter. I know many of you will resonate with my journey, and I'm sending you all love and light. Please take care of yourselves until next time. God bless.